Let me start by expressing my gratitude and for this great honour to be here representing John Waterlow, this man who would have dearly liked to have been here himself today, but his mobility at the moment is not good, but he does send his best wishes to you all, and we'll hear more about that from Alan Jackson this afternoon. So I want to use this opportunity to talk about the work, John Waterlow's legacy, in fact, at the London School of Hygiene over a long period of time. And this is quite a large body of work, a considerable number of animal studies that have been examining the nutritional and hormonal regulation of protein synthesis and proteolysis, human stable isotope studies examining nitrogen homeostasis, and all of this work geared towards a better understanding of protein turnover in mammalian tissues. Much of the early work was published in a book in 1978, which became a citation classic, and which John Waterlow has recently revised and published a second edition. I thought I would focus my presentation on a discussion of nitrogen balance regulation, and this was always something that John Waterlow has been very concerned about, and in a marvellous review that he published quite 10 years ago now, he commented that although the achievement and maintenance of nitrogen balance is a fact of life that we tend to take for granted, there are many features of it that are not understood, principally the control of urea production and excretion to match intake. And I want to take that particular area as the focus for my presentation, and consider what the main unresolved questions are about nitrogen balance. And there are two, really. The first one is the question of what is the minimum protein requirement for nitrogen equilibrium. And the second one is what is the extent of adaptation to low protein intakes and what mechanisms are involved. So the issue of adaptation is something that I'm going to explore. Now, much of our understanding of protein requirements has been summarized in these international reports from the World Health Authority and FAO. The first one published in 1973, of which John Waterlow was a member. The second one in 1985, where John Waterlow chaired the consultation, and the most recent one in 2007, where John Waterlow was a member, and Professor Jackson and myself were also part of this report, and so we were able to incorporate John Waterlow's concepts into this report. Now, the recent report identifies the protein requirement as the lowest protein intake that will balance nitrogen losses from the body and maintain the body protein mass at energy balance with modest levels of physical activity, plus any special needs. Now, the most recent report formalized the relationship between intake and requirement in terms of this model where the protein intake must meet the obligatory metabolic demand And there is a consensus on the magnitude of this component of the requirement. It involves the obligatory consumption of amino acids to form various metabolites in the body. And it represents quite a small amount of protein, about 0.3 of a gram per kilogram per day. And there's a general consensus on the magnitude of this obligatory metabolic demand. So in meeting this obligatory demand, the protein will be consumed by it, and any excess will be oxidized. So the dietary requirement then is identified in terms of the metabolic demand and the efficiency of protein utilization. And it is that latter question, the efficiency of utilization, which has proved to be so intractable and controversial. In fact, the international reports that I've shown you, the very first one defined the efficiency of utilization as reasonably high at 77%, and that defined an average requirement of just over 0.4 grams per kilogram per day. And there was a lot of concern expressed about that value. It was seen as too low. It was seen that a mistake had been made. And so in the 1985 report, a higher value was identified from nitrogen balance studies of 0.6 grams per kilogram per day, and this implies an efficiency of utilization of 50%. The most recent one identifies a value which is not very different, 0.66 grams per day, and that specifically identified the requirement by linear regression of nitrogen balance data, and the efficiency identified in that analysis was 47%, with a very wide range from quite high to really very low. So the real questions are, why is the efficiency of utilization for the minimum requirement so low? Just what is going on here? This is really very mysterious. And we can question from other data whether it's actually really as low as this. In fact, we know from John Waterlow's work of many years ago in Jamaica, feeding malnourished children, that the efficiency of utilization of protein in human milk is really very high, as you would expect it to be, approaching 90% or more. And many other feeding studies in children have similarly identified high values for the efficiency of utilization. In fact, in the recent report, the comment is made that an efficiency of only 50% in healthy people is inconsistent with a model of protein utilization in which only digestibility and biological value influence protein utilization. Remember, these requirement studies are from balance studies with very high quality protein, and so there is no a priori, there is no theoretical reason why the efficiency should be as low as this. The recent report identifies incomplete adaptation during the nitrogen balance studies, which could account for this very variable and low apparent efficiency of utilization. So the real question then is the extent and nature of adaptation to protein intakes, and the extent to which there is a consensus view on the importance of this. And there are, in fact, very, very different views. Professor Vernon Young, who was a very important leader of much of the work at MIT, has consistently argued that adaptation was not an important phenomenon, and that balance studies can be performed to give appropriate measures of the protein intake for the requirement after very short periods of only a few days of adaptation. But that view was challenged some years ago by Sukartmi and Margan in a rather complicated analysis of nitrogen balance, where they argued that there was within individual variability which was associated with adaptation. And certainly Professor Hegsted, who for many years headed nutrition at Harvard, has argued that if the requirement for any nutrient is to be defined, subjects must be allowed the time to adapt. Otherwise, one simply estimates the nutrient supply in the current diet, which has little nutritional significance. And so the idea behind this sort of approach is that short-term nitrogen balance studies are measuring the intake for balance, which is nearer to the habitual intake of the individuals rather than a true minimal requirement to the new low intakes. In fact, we've known for many years that when adults are put onto low protein diets, their nitrogen excretion falls very rapidly at first, but then it continues to decline over really very long periods of time. This is a heroic experiment where 20 men were put on a low protein diet for more than 6 months, and very careful measurements were made, and it's quite clear that for up to 6 months their nitrogen excretion was declining as they adapted to this lower intake. So what do we know about the actual metabolic changes in adaptation? As far as protein turnover is concerned, the work done at the London School indicated that the overall rate of turnover in the body was relatively insensitive to changes in protein intake, but there were very complex changes in the sensitivity of protein synthesis and proteolysis to amino acids in feeding and fasting. But the area that I want to talk about is the metabolic responses of amino acid and nitrogen, amino acid oxidation and nitrogen metabolism. And here we have been able to identify very important short and long-term changes in amino acid oxidation, which, although still poorly understood, enable us to have a better insight into what is likely to be going on as we adapt to lower protein intakes. The first important and rather surprising discovery was that amino acid oxidation and nitrogen excretion occurs continuously throughout any 24-hour period. It's not something that just happens after feeding, but even in the post-absorptive state, amino acids continue to be consumed and oxidized, and nitrogen is excreted. And the rate at which this occurs is very variable, but depends on the habitual level of protein intake. So individuals that consume high protein diets exhibit very high rates of amino acid oxidation, not only after their meals, but during the post-absorptive state. And that this rate changes really very, very slowly with a change in intake, with many months to actually completely stabilize. So one way of looking at this is that this adaptive oxidation creates a new metabolic demand for protein that is variable and adaptive according to the habitual intake. And so the model then for protein requirements is that there are two components, this rather small obligatory demand and this second adaptive metabolic demand that for most people is actually much larger than the obligatory demand. And that the meeting of these two components of the demand from the diet is what determines the protein requirement, together with any excess that is oxidized, and it's that excess oxidation that determines the efficiency of utilization. Now, it's quite difficult to understand what is going on here, but one clue, one important point, is the nature of the free amino acid pool in the tissues. If you measure free amino acids in human muscle, you see a wide range of amino acids. Some amino acids like glutamine are there in very large quantities, but many amino acids, and especially the branch chain, the aromatic and the sulfur amino acids, are present at really very low concentrations. And it's very important that they are maintained at low concentrations, because these amino acids are potentially toxic to the organism. We know this from children with inborn errors of metabolism that cannot deal with and metabolize the branch chain amino acids or the aromatic amino acids. They develop severe pathologies and actually will die if they're not treated. So this adaptive metabolic demand is a means of ensuring at all times that these amino acids, these particular essential amino acids, are never allowed to accumulate. So we have a series of metabolic pathways to remove them that are highly regulated, both acutely in response to feeding, but also chronically in terms of their capacity as a result of the protein intake. So the organism is always able to dispose of surplus essential amino acids and avoid them building up. So we've been able to probe this model using both nitrogen and stable isotope C13 leucine oxidation balance studies in the fed and fasted state. And this is the model that we have been working with. The idea is that we have our continuous oxidation of amino acids that constitutes the adaptive metabolic demand and the obligatory metabolic demand, and that in the post-absorptive state the body protein is mobilized to supply this demand, whereas in the postprandial state, during feeding, then dietary protein will replace the post-absorptive losses of protein in the body and also supply the adaptive and obligatory metabolic demand. And by examining the transition between the fed and the fasted state in carbon-13 leucine infusion studies, we can actually quantify just how much of the amino acid oxidation is part of the adaptive demand, or how much of it represents meal-dependent losses. So we can measure the efficiency of protein utilization in this model much more accurately than in the traditional nitrogen balance study. And so we've actually conducted quite a large number of various experiments, and the important finding is that when we look at the efficiency of utilization of mixed animal protein diets or milk protein, then we find really high levels of efficiency of utilization, as you would expect, because these are proteins that are highly digestible and have a good biological value. We find lower levels with wheat protein because of the unusual amino acid composition. But this work has really shown quite clearly that protein utilization is as one would expect it to be in humans, with a high efficiency. And so I've tried to visualize, to show you how we perceive the body protein mass is regulated throughout the diurnal cycle of feeding and fasting. In the fed state, we gain protein up to a regulated level so that our body protein stores are then appropriate for our size and shape. And then in the post-absorptive state, we lose protein. And so we have this diurnal cycling of gains and losses throughout each 24 hours. But importantly, the amplitude, how much is lost and gained, varies according to the habitual protein intake. So that with higher protein intakes, much more protein is lost at night, and then that is retained in the day to achieve balance. So superficially looking at individuals on different protein intakes, they all look exactly the same in terms of a normal body composition, but they are behaving really quite differently. And so we can use this approach to better understand nitrogen balance studies and exactly why they give this apparent low efficiency. And it is because of incomplete adaptation. This results in a shallow slope of the balance curve, and with improving adaptation, then the slope becomes steeper and the metabolic demands become less, and so we move towards a better representation of the true minimum requirement. But unfortunately, it's quite clear that in short-term balances we don't achieve sufficient adaptation to give us the correct answer. So what we would argue, therefore, is that although there is a wide range of protein requirements indicated by the nitrogen balance data, and although FAO has chosen to identify the median of this range as the minimum requirement, from this adaptive metabolic demands model, we would argue that the true minimum requirement is at the bottom end of that range. But unfortunately, we don't know exactly how low it is, but it's certainly lower than the values that are currently being used. So, summing up, the minimum protein requirement for nitrogen balance is very low. In fact, it's below the intakes of almost all nutritionally balanced diets, which makes it to a certain extent not particularly nutritionally relevant. It also is implicit that the risk of protein deficiency is very low, and it certainly is low for children and for most adult population groups. The important question about protein now, I believe, relates to what is the optimal protein intake for long-term health. In other words, how does the protein intake in the diet impact on chronic disease or on a satisfactory output in pregnancy, or the loss of skeletal muscle in old age, sarcopenia, or the development of osteoporosis. All of these conditions have been identified to be associated with varying protein intake, and for many of them, higher protein intakes may well be beneficial. Also in weight maintenance and the management of obesity, and certainly in athletic performance. The problem is that we have a very poor understanding of that at the moment, and so it's much more difficult for us to reach a consensus of what protein intakes populations ought to be consuming. So I'm going to finish there and once again express my acknowledgements to John Waterlow, who was my PhD supervisor, my head of department and mentor, and has been a close friend and remains a continuing inspiration to me. So thank you very much for your attention. And I would much rather have spoken in Spanish, but unfortunately my Spanish is not very good. Thank you.